Hello, squirrel listeners. Thought I brought my drink in here, but I didn't. We'll try to get along without it. It's shining right on me, but shine over there. It's almost too bright. The body in the library. I tell y'all, I found this. Where? In my caddy. Just overlooked it. The Body in the Library by Agatha Christie, and chapter 17. I forgot how many. Sir Henry's face was very grave. He said, "I don't like it." "I'm aware," said Miss Marple, "that it isn't what you call orthodox, but it is so important, isn't it, to be quite sure? To make assurance doubly sure, as Shakespeare has it. I think if Mr. Jefferson would agree. What about Harper? Is he to be in on this? It might be awkward for him to know too much, but there might be a hint from you to watch certain persons, have them trailed, you know." Sir Henry said slowly, "Yes, that would meet the case." Superintendent Harper looked piercingly at Sir Henry Clithering. "Let's get this quite clear, sir. You're giving me a hint?" Sir Henry said, "I'm informing you of what my friend has just informed me. He didn't tell me in confidence that he proposes to visit a solicitor in Dannemouth tomorrow for the purpose of making a new will." The superintendent's bushy eyebrows drew downwards over his steady eyes. He said, "Does Mr. Conway Jefferson propose to inform his son-in-law and daughter-in-law of that fact?" "He intends to tell them about it this evening." "I see." The superintendent tapped his desk with a pen holder. He repeated again, "I see." Then the piercing eyes bored once more into the eyes of the other man, and Harper said, "So you're not satisfied with the case against Basil Blake? Are you?" The superintendent's mustache quivered. He said, "Is Miss Marple?" The two men looked at each other. Then Harper said, "You can leave it to me. I'll have men detailed. There'll be no funny business. I can promise you that." Sir Henry said, "There's one more thing. You'd better see this." He unfolded a slip of paper and pushed it across the table. This time the superintendent's calm deserted him. He whistled. "So that's it, is it? That puts an entirely different complexion on the matter. How did you come to dig up this?" "Women," said Sir Henry, "are eternally interested in marriages." "Especially," said the superintendent, "elderly single women." Conway Jefferson looked up as his friend entered. His grim face relaxed into a smile. He said, "Well, I told them. They took it very well." "What did you say?" "Told them that as Ruby was dead, I felt that the $50,000 I'd originally left her should go to something I could associate with her memory. It was to endow a hostel for young girls working as professional dancers in London. Damn silly way to leave your money. Surprised they swallowed it. As though I'd do a thing like that." He added meditatively, "You know, I made a fool of myself over that girl. Must be turning into a silly old man. I can see it now. She was a pretty kid, but most of what I saw in her I put there myself. I pretended she was another Rosamond. Same coloring, you know, but not the same heart or mind. Hand me that paper. Rather an interesting bridge problem." Sir Henry went downstairs. He asked a question of his porter. "Mr. Gaskell, sir. He's just gone off in the Oh, that was a question. Mr. Gaskell, sir? He's just gone off in his car, had to go to London. Oh, I see. Is Mrs. Jefferson about? Mrs. Jefferson, sir, has just gone up to bed. Sir Henry looked into the lounge and through to the ballroom. In the lounge, Hugo McLean was doing a crossword puzzle and frowning a good deal over it. In the ballroom, Josie was smiling valiantly into the face of a stout, perspiring man as her nimble feet avoided his destructive tread. The stout man was clearly enjoying his dance. Raymond, graceful and weary, was dancing with an anemic-looking girl with adenoids. Dull brown hair and an expensive and exceedingly unbecoming dress. Sir Henry said under his breath, "And so to bed," and went upstairs. Adenoids. It was 3 o'clock. The wind had fallen. The moon was shining over the quiet sea. In Conway Jefferson's room there was no sound except his own heavy breathing as he lay, half propped up on pillows. There was no breeze to stir the curtains at the window, but they stirred. For a moment they parted and a figure was silhouetted against the moonlight. Then they fell back into place. Everything was quiet again, but there was someone else inside the room. Nearer and nearer to the bed the intruder stole. The deep breathing on the pillow did not relax. There was a sound, or there was no sound, or hardly any sound. A finger and thumb were ready to pick up a fold of skin. In the other hand, the hypodermic was ready. And then, suddenly out of the shadows, a hand came and closed over the hand that held the needle. The other arm held the figure in an iron grasp. An unemotional voice, the voice of the law, said, "No, you don't. I want that needle." The light switched on, and from his pillows Conway Jefferson looked grimly at the murderer of Ruby King. And that's all. Do we read another? Or do we leave it there? Since I got the crud and nothing to drink. And I'm cold. All right, I'll read another. Or see how much I can read. Chapter 18. Sir Henry Clithering said, "Speaking as Watson, I want to know your methods, Miss Marple." Superintendent Harper said, "I'd like to know what put you onto it first." Colonel Melchett said, "You've done it again, by Jove. I want to hear all about it from the beginning." Miss Marple soothed the puce silk of her best evening gown. She flushed and smiled and looked very self-conscious. She said, "I'm afraid you'll think my methods, as Sir Henry calls them, are terribly amateurish. The truth is, you see, that most people, and I don't exclude policemen, are far too trusting for this wicked world. They believe what is told them. I never do. I'm afraid I always like to prove a thing for myself." "That is the scientific attitude," said Sir Henry. "In this case," continued Miss Marple, "certain things were taken for granted from the first. Instead of just confining oneself to the facts as I noted them, were that the victim was quite young, that she bit her nails, and that her teeth stuck out a little, as young girls so often do if not corrected in time with a plate." I guess they mean braces. "And children are very naughty about their plates and taking them out when their elders aren't looking. But that is wandering from the point. Where was I? Oh, yes, looking down at the dead girl and feeling sorry, because it's always sad to see a young life cut short, and thinking that whoever had done it was a very wicked person. Of course, it was all very confusing, her being found in Colonel Bantry's library altogether. too like a book to be true. In fact, it made the wrong pattern. It wasn't, you see, meant, which confused us a lot. The real idea had been to plant the body on poor young Basil Blake, and in parentheses, a much more likely person. And his actions in putting it in the Colonel's library delayed things considerably and must have been a source of great annoyance to the real murderer. Originally, you see, Mr. Blake would have been the first object of suspicion. They'd have made inquiries at Dannemouth, found he knew the girl, then found he had tied himself up with another girl, and they'd have assumed that Ruby came to blackmail him or something like that, and that he had strangled her in a fit of rage. Just an ordinary, sordid, what I call nightclub type of crime. But that, of course, all went wrong, and interest became focused much too soon on the Jefferson family, to the great annoyance of a certain person. As I've told you, I've got a very suspicious mind. My cousin Raymond tells me, and in parentheses, in fun, of course, and quite affectionately, that I have a mind like a sink. He says that most Victorians have. All I can say is that the Victorians knew a good deal about human nature. As I say, having this rather insanitary, or surely sanitary, mind, I looked at once at the money angle of it. Two people stood to benefit by this girl's death. You couldn't get away from that. £50,000 is a lot of money, especially when you're in financial difficulties, as both these people were. Of course, they both seemed very nice, agreeable people. They didn't seem likely people, but one never can tell, can one? Mrs. Jefferson, for instance. Everyone liked her, but it didn't seem clear that she had become, but it did seem clear that she had become very restless that summer, and that she was tired of the life she led, completely dependent on her father-in-law. She knew because the doctor had told her that he couldn't live long, so that was all right, to put it callously, or it would have been all right if Ruby Keene hadn't come along. Mrs. Jefferson was passionately devoted to her son, and some women have a curious idea that crimes committed for the sake of their offspring are almost morally justified. I've come across that attitude once or twice in the village. Well, 'twas all for Daisy, you see, miss, they say, and seem to think that makes doubtful conduct quite all right. Very lax thinking. Mr. Mark Gaskell, of course, was a much more likely starter, if I may use such a sporting expression. He was a gambler and had not, I fancied, a very high moral code. But for certain reasons, I was of the opinion that a woman was concerned in this crime. As I say, with my eye on motive, the money angle seemed very suggestive. It was annoying, therefore, to find that both these people had alibis for the time when Ruby Keene, according to the medical evidence, had met her death. But soon afterwards, there came the discovery of the burnt-out car with Emily Reeves' body in it, and then the whole thing leaped to the eye. The alibis, of course, were worthless. I now had two halves of the case, and both quite convincing, but they didn't fit. There must be a connection, but I could not find it. The one person whom I knew to be concerned in the crime hadn't got a motive. It was stupid of me, said Miss Marple meditatively. If it hadn't been for Dinah Lee, I shouldn't have thought of it. The most obvious thing in the world, Somerset House, marriage. It wasn't a question of only Mr. Gaskell or Mrs. Jefferson. There were the further possibilities of marriage. If either of those two was married or even was likely to marry, then the other party to the marriage contract was involved too. Raymond, for instance, might think he had a pretty good chance of marrying a rich wife. He had been very assiduous to Mrs. Jefferson, and it was his charm, I think, that awoke her from her long widowhood. She'd been quite content just being a daughter to Mr. Jefferson. Like Ruth and Naomi, only Naomi, if you remember, took a lot of trouble to arrange a suitable marriage for Ruth. Besides Raymond, there was Mr. McLean. She liked him very much, and it seemed highly possible she would marry him in the end. He wasn't well off, and he was not far from Dannemouth on the night in question. So it seemed, didn't it, said Miss Marple, as though anyone might have done it. But of course, really in my mind, I knew. You couldn't get away, could you, from those bitten nails? Nails? Said Sir Henry, but she tore her nail and cut the others. Nonsense, said Miss Marple. Bitten nails and close-cut nails are quite different. Nobody could mistake them who knew anything about girls' nails. Very ugly bitten nails, as I always tell the girls in my class. Those nails, you see, were a fact. And they could only mean one thing. The body in Colonel Bantry's library wasn't Ruby Keene at all. And that brings you straight to the one person who must be concerned. Josie. Josie identified the body. She knew, she must have known that it wasn't Ruby Keene's body. She said it was. She was puzzled, completely puzzled, at finding that body where it was. She practically betrayed that fact. Why? Because she knew. She knew none better where it ought to have been found, in Basil Blake's cottage. Who directed our attention to Basil? Josie, by saying to Raymond that Ruby might have been with the film man, and before that by slipping a snapshot of him into Ruby's handbag, who cherished such bitter anger against the dead girl that she couldn't hide it. She couldn't hide it even when she looked down at her dead. Josie, who was shrewd, practical, hard as nails, and all out of money. Wow. That is what I meant about believing too readily. Nobody thought of disbelieving Josie's statement that the body was Ruby Keene's, simply because it didn't seem at the time that she could have any motive for lying. Motive was always the difficulty. Josie was clearly involved, but Ruby's death seemed, if anything, contrary to her interest. It was not till Dinah Lee mentioned Somerset House that I got the connection. Marriage. If Josie and Mark Gaskell were actually married, then the whole thing was clear. As we know now, Mark and Josie were married a year later. They were keeping it dark until Mr. Jefferson died. It was really quite interesting, you know, tracing out the course of events. Seeing exactly how the plan had worked out, complicated and yet simple. First of all, the selection of the poor child, Pamela, the approach to her from the film angle, a screen test, of course the poor child couldn't resist, not when it was put up to her as plausibly as Mark Gaskell put it. She comes to the hotel. He's waiting for her. He takes her in by the side door and introduces her to Josie, one of the makeup experts. That poor child. It makes me quite sick to think of it. Sitting in Josie's bathroom while Josie bleaches her hair and makes up her face and varnishes her fingernails and toenails. During all this, the drug was given, and an ice cream soda, very likely. She goes off into a coma. I imagine that they put her into one of the empty rooms opposite. They were only cleaned once a week, remember? After dinner, Mark Gaskell went out in his car to the seafront, he said. That is when he took Pamela's body to the cottage dressed in one of Ruby's old dresses and arranged it on his hearth rug. She was still unconscious, but not dead, when he strangled her with the belt of the frock. Not nice, no, but I hope and pray she knew nothing about it. Really, I feel quite pleased to think of him being hanged. That must have been just after 10 o'clock. Then he drove back at top speed and found the others in the lounge, where Ruby King, still alive, was dancing her exhibition dance with Raymond. I should imagine that Josie had given Ruby instructions beforehand. Ruby was accustomed to doing what Josie told her. She was to change, go into Josie's room, and wait. She too was drugged, probably an after-dinner coffee. She was yawning, remember, when she talked to young Bartlett. Josie came up later to look for her, but nobody but Josie went into Josie's room. She probably finished the girl off then with an injection, perhaps, or a blow on the back of the head. She went down, danced with Raymond, debated with the Jeffersons where Ruby could be, and finally went to bed. In the early hours of the morning, she dressed the girl in Pamela's clothes, carried the body down the side stairs — she was a strong, muscular young woman — fetched George Bartlett's car, drove 2 miles to the quarry, poured petrol over the car, and set it alight. Then she walked back to the hotel, probably timing her arrival there at 8 or 9 o'clock, up early in her anxiety about Ruby. An intricate plot, said Colonel Melchett. Not more intricate than the steps of a dance, said Miss Marple. I suppose not. She was very thorough, said Miss Marple. She even foresaw the discrepancy of the nails. That's why she managed to break one of Ruby's nails on her shawl. It made an excuse for pretending that Ruby had clipped her nails close. Harper said yes, she thought of everything, and the only real proof you had, Miss Marple, was a schoolgirl's bitten nails. More than that, said Miss Marple, people will talk too much. Mark Gaskell talked too much. He was speaking of Ruby, and he said her teeth ran down her throat. But the dead girl in Colonel Bantry's library had teeth that stuck out. My buddies may be going live. Oh, Lordy, wrap this up. I'm so thirsty. Conway Jefferson said rather grimly, and was the last dramatic finale your idea, Miss Marple? Miss Marple confessed, well, it was. As a matter of fact, it's so nice to be sure, isn't it? Sure is the word, said Conway Jefferson grimly. You see, said Miss Marple, once Mark and Josie knew that you were going to make a new will, they'd have to do something. That already committed 2 murders. on account of the money, so they might as well commit a third. Mark, of course, must be absolutely clear. So he went off to London and established an alibi by dining at a restaurant with friends and going on to a nightclub. Josie was to do the work. They still wanted Ruby's death to be put down to Basil's account. So Mr. Jefferson's death must be thought due to his heart failing. There was digitalin, so the superintendent tells me, in the syringe. Any doctor would think death from heart trouble quite natural in the circumstances. Josie had loosened one of the stone balls on the balcony, and she was going to let it crash down afterwards. His death would be put down to the shock of the noise. Melchett said, "Ingenious devil." Sir Henry said, "So the third death you spoke of was to be Conway Jefferson?" Miss Marple shook her head. "Oh, no, I meant Basil Blake. They'd have got him hanged if they could." "Or shut up in Broadmoor," said Sir Henry. Conway Jefferson grunted. He said, I always knew. Rosamond had married a rotter. Tried not to admit it to myself. She was damned fond of him, fond of a murderer. Well, he'll hang as well as the woman. I'm glad he went to pieces and gave the show away. Miss Marple said she was always the strong character. It was her plan throughout. The irony of it is that she got the girl down here herself, never dreaming that she would take Mr. Jefferson's fancy and ruin all her own prospects. Jefferson said, "Poor lass, poor little Ruby." Adelaide Jefferson and Hugo McLean came in. Adelaide looked almost beautiful tonight. She came to Conway Jefferson and laid a hand on his shoulder. She said with a little catch in her breath, "I want to tell you something, Jeff, at once. I want to tell you something, Jeff, at once. I'm going to marry Hugo." Conway Jefferson looked up at her for a moment. He said gruffly, "About time you married again. Congratulations to you both. By the way, Addie, I'm making a new will tomorrow." She nodded. "Oh, yes, I know." Jefferson said, "No, you don't. I'm settling £10,000 on you. Everything else I have goes to Peter when I die. How does that suit you, my girl?" "Oh, Jeff," her voice broke, "you're wonderful. He's a nice lad. I'd like to see a good deal of him in the time I've got left." "Oh, you shall." I can't read anymore, y'all. Let's see how much I got. Oh, no, we're almost done. "Got a great feeling for crime, Peter has," said Conway Jefferson meditatively. She likes that word. "Not only has he got the fingernail of the murdered girl, one of the murdered girls anyway, but he was lucky enough to have a bit of Josie's shawl caught in with the nail. So he's got a souvenir of the murderess too. That makes him very happy." Hugo and Adelaide passed by the ballroom. Raymond came up to them. Adelaide said rather quickly, "I must tell you my news. We're going to be married." The smile on Raymond's face was perfect, a brave, pensive smile. "I hope," he said, ignoring Hugo and gazing into her eyes, "that you will be very, very happy." They passed on, and Raymond stood looking after them. "A nice woman," he said to himself. "A very nice woman. And she would have had money too. The trouble I took to mug up that bit about the Devonshire stars. Oh well. My luck's out. Dance, dance, little gentleman. And Raymond returned to the ballroom. And that's it. What? So, let's see what we'll read next. I'll have to let you know when, like tomorrow, I guess, whenever I read next. There is a series, let's see, I'll have to see the other Miss Marple books. There's only a couple more, cause the rest of them, there's several Miss Marple books, but some of them were written too late to be in the public domain, so I'll just have to check it out. But there's a series of Agatha Christie books that are called Tommy Tuppence. So we'll have to see. There might be one more Miss Marple that I can get. I'll look it up right quick. Okay. The Moving Finger might be one. I think that's the last one we can. Yeah, I think that's the last one that we can read because of the dates. But I'll let you know for sure tomorrow. Or whenever I read next. Should be tomorrow. Love y'all. Be sweet. Don't be ugly. Bye-bye.